Hello students, from today we begins with new chapter, that cell cycle and cell division. In previous session or last session we already completed the cell and its structure, and now let's we study about the cell cycle and cell division. So when first in today's session we only discuss about what is cell cycle, what is the importance of cell cycle, and the most important thing when we study cell cycle, that the four important phases of the cell cycle. So first you see what is cell cycle. Before the beginning or before we come towards the definition, first when we study about cell cycle, so suppose this is one of the cell. This cell slowly occupy a specific growth, and then after this cell undergoes in a division. Simple division. When you study about the cell cycle, the mostly you remember whenever we come towards the M phase of cell cycle, so you remember that is the simple mitosis division. So this cell you remember undergoes in division, and after division this cell will lead to the production of two daughter cells. Now these two daughter cells also undergoes in the phase of growth and development, and then after these cells further occupy a specific volume, or we can say these cells occupy the cytoplasmic and karyoplasmic ratio. There is always a ratio between the cytoplasm and karyoplasm, and after that the cytoplasm and karyoplasm ratio is specifically obtained, then again due to some throat infection. So again you remember these two cells further undergoes in division, and upon division they will lead to the production of, every cell produces two daughter cells. So now what we are studying, actually we come towards now the cell cycle. What actually cell cycle? In cell cycle you remember this division is take place for the first time. Here the division is take place for the second time, and this process is a continued process. The cell upon gaining maturity undergoes in division, and after division the cell will lead to the production of two daughter cell, and in this way slowly the number of cells are formed from a single parent cell. So you remember cell cycle means there are some regular events, prescribed format में all these events. So these regular events you remember are take place in particular sequence, and these sequences predominantly present in between the two successive divisions or in between the coming successive division. So cell cycle means you remember the regular event take place in prescribed manner and responsible for the division of cell. When the division of cell is take place, so at that time you remember the synthesis of genome. Genome means you remember the haploid content of DNA, normally called as genome. So the synthesis of genome is take place. Cytoplasmic content or the constituents of the cell, that's why we say the karyoplasmic ratio and cytoplasmic ratio is increases, and after that the cell proceed to the division. So this is the simple definition. Now you remember when we come towards the cell cycle. So cell cycle means you remember cell cycle is regular events in between two successive cell divisions when cell undergoes in first DNA synthesis or genome synthesis, second you remember cell constituent also synthesize, and the third cell proceed to division, or it is called as M phase. Again, upon division, when the division is take place, two daughter cells are formed. These two daughter cells further undergoes in DNA synthesis, in cell constituent synthesis. That means you remember they obtain the cytoplasmic and karyoplasmic ratio, and after that you remember they further proceed to the next cycle of the division. So this part you remember very well. Now when we come towards the cell cycle, so here you remember the cell cycle show the basic phases. So here we discuss about cell cycle and its phases. So this chart you remember very well for the phases. When we discuss about the phases, so broadly cell cycle is divided into two phases. The first phase of cell cycle is called interphase, and the second phase is the division phase. This phase is commonly called as M phase or mitosis phase. Now again you see the interphase further divided into three subphases that we study in detail later. So interphase further divided into three subphases. These phases are called as G1 phase, S phase and G2 phase. So these four phases, mainly the cell cycle divided into two, interphase and M phase. But when we come towards the interphase is the longest phase. Whatever time of time is required for a cell cycle in particular species, of that you remember 95% of the time is required for interphase. So you remember interphase is the longest phase of cell cycle, and it further completed by G1 as G2. And once the G2 is completed, then the cell is proceed to the M phase or mitosis phase. So here generally one question is asked that what is the sequence of phases of cell cycle. So for that you remember whenever you study the phases, so you remember G1 as G2 and M. This is the sequence of the various phases of the cell cycle. Now first we study what is interphase, what is M phase, and then we come towards the identical properties of G1 S and G2 phase. But before that, first we draw the diagram for cell cycle. So here when we study about the cell cycle, so here you remember cell cycle broadly divided, clear cut. If you go, this diagram is provided in NCERT also. Okay, so here you remember, here we study cell cycle. Cell cycle broadly divided into two phases, that is I phase or interphase you can say, and the second phase is called as M phase. Again the I phase you remember, I phase is divided into three distinct phases, that is the first phase is called as G1, second phase of the I phase is called as, the third phase is called as G2, and after that the M phase begins. M phase you remember clearly divided into two that is first the nuclear division is take place. Nuclear division is called as karyokinesis, and after karyokinesis the cytokinesis is proceed. So karyokinesis, you remember, divided into further 4 phases. So these 4 phases we not study during cell cycle. These phases we predominantly study when we study about the mitosis and meiosis division. Here you remember prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. After telophase, cell undergoes in cytokinesis, and upon cytokinesis, you remember, from a single cell the 2 daughter cells are produced. So this part you remember. Now what is the future of these 2 daughter cells? So from here we study that how the cell cycle begins. Cell cycle begins after the completion of cytokinesis, when 2 daughter cells are formed and these 2 daughter cells enter in interphase, then the cell cycle begins. So here when we discuss about the interphase, so interphase initially actually it is called as resting phase, but here you remember interphase, now it is discovered and proved that the interphase is a metabolically active phase, because the daughter cells or the cells during interphase prepared for the next cell division. So that's why you remember interphase आपके पास क्या है? Interphase means the phase which is present in between the 2 mitosis division. This is the phase, this is the first division, this is the second division. In between first and second division, this phase in which the cell is preparing for division, that phase is actually called as interphase. So interphase, first you remember, interphase is a phase between 2 successive division, or the division phase you remember. Division phase is called as M phase, first thing. Secondly, it takes or required 95% time of cell cycle. So this part you remember. Now when we discuss the time for cell cycle, so here you remember time for cell cycle for objective purpose or NEET purpose. This part is important in human being. 24 hours human being cells, human being you remember, in human being cells required 24 hours for the interphase, and out of these 24 hours, mitosis phase you remember, this M phase, this phase itself completed in 1 hour. That means nearly 23 hours are required for the interphase. Similarly, you remember, if we come towards the yeast or Saccharomyces cerevisiae, so in yeast you remember 90 minutes is a time period. These all things are provided in NCERT. So you go through the NCERT and very carefully read the introduction and interphase. So you find out all these time period. So yeast you remember, yeast required 90 minutes for the completion of the cell cycle. Now interphase you remember, during interphase the cell is preparing for the cell division, and here one of the most important question is generally asked for the chromosome number. So in terms of chromosome number, G1 you remember, if the diploid cell is entered, so the G1 you remember, G1 show the diploid chromosome number, S phase also show the diploid chromosome number even, G2 also show the diploid chromosome number. But in S phase, the DNA content become increases, the DNA content from 2C to become a 4C. That means due to synthesis of DNA inside the chromosome, the content of DNA just double. So there is no change in the number of chromosome, only the content of DNA is just double. So in S phase DNA content is 2C to 4C, and in G2 phase also you remember the DNA content is 4C. This 4C content again maintained to 2C during the process of mitosis division or during the phase of division. This part you remember. Now when we discuss the three phases of interphase, at that time you remember one more phases appear in the cell cycle. This phase is called as G0 phase, or it is called quiescent phase. So this you remember, quiescent phase, the phase in which once the cell enter, cell never undergoes in division. So the cell when complete their function metabolically, silently complete their function, but cell never show any kind of division, then such type of cells are always be present in G0. So cells you remember, the nerve cells or neurons, you very well remember, they are always remain in the quiescent stage or in G0 or G0 भी कहते हैं. So G0 or G0 phase. So now we discuss the detailed part of the interphase, that what are the different phases of interphase. So students, we discuss about the first phase of the interphase. What is the first phase? First phase is G1 phase. So here first we discuss about G1 phase. What G1 phase? G1 phase you remember as you appear that diagram. So G1 phase you remember, the G1 phase predominantly take place after mitosis division. That's why the G1 is called as post mitotic gap phase. This you remember very well. Secondly, in G1 phase, it is deciding phase, because in this phase itself decided whether the cell enter in S phase or the cell remain as it is in G0 phase. So it is finally decided in G1 phase only whether the cell is proceed to cell division. If the cell proceed to cell division, then cell enter in S phase, or cell remain as it is without division. That means cell always present in G0 phase or quiescent stage. Thirdly, important feature of G1 you remember, the duplication of cell organelles. So here you remember duplication of cell organelle, but in cell organelle never remember the centriole. Centriole duplication in animal cell predominantly take place during the S phase. So here you remember cell organelles start to duplicate during the G1 phase. So this part you remember, chromosome number as we already discussed, 2n chromosome number is always be present. Metabolically G1 is one of the most active phase. Now in G1 phase you remember, in between G1 and S one checkpoint is here, checkpoint is there. So here you remember, when cells successfully crosses checkpoint 1, then cell cycle किसमें enter होगा? Cell cycle enters in S phase. So this part you remember very well. So this one thing, checkpoint we separately study in that diagram, because for checkpoint 2 repeatedly question is asked in NEET, that what are the phases in between the checkpoint 2 is present and what are the checkpoint, that we also study separately. Secondly, we discuss about the second phase, that is called as S phase. S phase commonly called as synthetic phase. Now synthetic phase means what to be synthesized. So here only you remember, in plant DNA synthesis, in animals or in animal cell you remember DNA as well as centriole synthesis is take place. So this is the identical feature for centriole also. Number of time you appear the question in last year papers, that centriole synthesis in cell cycle is appear at. So in animal cell we already studied, in animal cells only centrioles are present. These centrioles are required for spindle formation, so that you remember that in animal cell along with DNA synthesis, centriole synthesis or centriole duplication, you can say. Actually centriole duplicate never synthesize, but along with DNA synthesis we commonly use the term centriole synthesis take place in S phase. Now when the DNA synthesis is take place, because of that in S phase you remember the DNA content become double. So DNA content one of the most important thing for the S phase, and for your NEET exam DNA content is get doubled because DNA is synthesized, and because of that the diploid content of DNA become a 4C. So this part you remember very well, but it never affect the number of chromosome. Chromosome number in S phase, you always remember chromosome number is always a diploid if the cell is diploid. Again variations are here. Recall the आप स्टडी करते आ रहे हैं इन चैप्टर 3 प्लेंटी किंगडम वी स्टडीड. इन प्लेंटी किंगडम वी से algae and bryophyte show the haploid body, gametophytic body. From pteridophyta onward the parents body are diploid. So in plants haploid as well as diploid, both the type of cell can be undergoes in mitosis. But in animal, because the animal body is totally made up of diploid cells, so in animal you remember the body, diploid body or diploid cells only undergoes in the process of mitosis division. So this much you remember for the S phase. And now we come towards the third phase, that is the G2 phase. G2 phase you remember. Now you again appear the position of G2 phase. G2 phase you remember, G2 phase is present prior to mitosis division. That's why G2 phase is also called as pre-mitotic gap phase. So this part you remember, gap, this is also called as gap 1, this is called as gap 2, but these phases, this name you remember very well. G2 phase, identical feature. G2 phase you remember mainly RNA and protein synthesis you remember here take place. So protein synthesis, and if RNA synthesis remains, so RNA synthesis is only take place in G2. Secondly, in this phase all the requirement of the cell cycles to be checked, whether all the cell organelle, all the RNA, all the types of proteins, whether synthesized or not. In case if any RNA, protein or any of the cell organelle is remain to duplicate or synthesize, then their synthesis or duplication let's completed in G2 phase, and then after the cell is proceed to the M phase or cell cycle enters into the M phase. This part you remember. G2 phase, G2 phase, after G2 phase again you remember this is a checkpoint 2. Here you remember the checkpoint 2 present after G2 phase. So this part you remember very well. Now here we come towards the checkpoint. What are the checkpoint? Checkpoint means you remember a special class of protein that is called as CDK protein or cyclin dependent kinase protein. These CDK proteins are specially required for transforming the one phase of the cell cycle into another, that is called as checkpoints. Two checkpoints are there in cell cycle. The first checkpoint you remember, first checkpoint is present between G1 and S, and it required CDK protein. So this part you remember, clear? And after that the second checkpoint we study, second time CDK proteins required. CDK proteins are dependent on ATP activity. So in simple terms you remember, when sufficient amount of ATPs are available in the cells during cell cycle, then only the cell from G1 transform into the S. Similarly, the second checkpoint, you remember, second checkpoint is present. Checkpoint 2. Checkpoint 2, you remember, is present between G2 and M. This part you remember very well, because most of the time one option is provided there. The second checkpoint is present in between G2 and P, and most of the students put the correct mark on the G2 and P, but you remember P means prophase. Prophase is not an individual phase, it is a subphase or a phase of a mitosis division. So second checkpoint, you remember, second checkpoint is always present in between the G2 and M phase. When cell enters in cell cycle and successfully crosses these energy barriers which is called as checkpoints, then only the cell is proceed to M phase. What is M phase? M, you remember, I only just in short explain the M phase, because in next session we discuss the mitosis division, and when we detail study about mitosis division, so automatically we study about the M phase. So M phase means, you remember, the phase of mitosis division. When interphase is nearly completed, cell crosses the second checkpoint. After that, cell enter into M phase. During M phase, first the nucleus is divided by 4 subphases: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. What are their important identical features and how the one phase enters into another phase, that we will discuss that we will discuss in our next session. Okay? So here you remember M phase, when first karyokinesis is completed. Upon completion of karyokinesis, in a single cell, 2 nuclei are formed. And secondly, here you remember, if the diploid cell enter in M phase, so resulting both the daughter cells are diploid. In plant cell, haploid cell also enters in mitosis. So the resulting both the cells are haploid cells. So that way all the things we discuss in mitosis division. And upon completion of cytokinesis or M phase, 2 daughter cells are produced. These 2 daughter cells again enter into G1 phase, because these 2 daughter cells by this interface again gain the cytoplasmic and karyoplasmic ratio, and after that they proceed to the next phase of the division or M phase. So in this way you remember that the cell cycles are completed continuously, one by one after other, the regular cell cycle events are take place, and because of that the cells become modified into tissues and tissue become a organ. So this much you remember for the today's session, that in which we mainly study about cell cycle. Revise this topic very carefully, read NCERT line to line. Again I am saying must read NCERT for the cell cycle, because for theory exam phases are separately asked, but for objective purpose and NEET purpose, this is one of the most important topic. So you never skip the cell cycle. Entire chapter is important, but the cell cycle, because if you clear about cell cycle, then division is quite समझ में आ जाता है. In division only sometime in meiosis division prophase 1 is quite lengthy and long process, so over there only students are get confused. So that when we will study, so I clear and give some tricks that how will you recollect the all 5 sub phases of the prophase 1. So here this much you remember for today's session, and with this I finish my today's session. The students who are new for the session, they kindly go through the previous videos, and if you like the content, so subscribe my channel, like my videos, and stay connected with Dr. DEEPA Dahake's NEET Biology.